Now, Russia has begun an early spring offensive in Ukraine, intensifying fighting along the eastern front after a winter pause. Russian forces are focusing on the Donbas so-called fortress belt, using drones, missiles and mechanized assaults to test Ukrainian defenses. Along the 1,250-kilometer front line, both sides are stepping up strikes, including major drone exchanges. For now, Russia has made only limited gains, but is attempting to expand footholds in eastern and southern regions. Ukraine says it's holding its positions under heavy pressure. Monty Francis gives us the latest.
The people who live in this apartment building in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro got the shock of their lives when a Russian drone struck early Thursday morning as most of them slept, setting fire to the first two floors.
I was in bed when I heard the sound of the incoming drone. I couldn't believe it at first until the very moment it struck. All of our windows were blown out. I was in shock and didn't know what to do.
It was just one of almost 1,000 drones launched by Moscow at Ukraine since Tuesday, along with 34 missiles, in one of the largest aerial attacks of the war. Kyiv responded with almost 400 drones of its own, targeting Russia and occupied Crimea, in what's believed to be the largest overnight attack by Kyiv since the war began more than 4 years ago. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president told Reuters that the Trump administration is pressuring Ukraine to cede the rest of the eastern Donbas region to Russia to end the war, a land area that covers about 5,000 square kilometers. But Zelensky says giving up the territory would just play into Putin's hands.
Therefore, I believe that withdrawing from the east of our country poses a high risk to Ukraine and to Europe.
At a gathering of G7 diplomats outside of Paris, the EU's foreign policy chief said she agrees.
It is, of course, the Russian playbook of negotiations that they are demanding something that has never been theirs. And that's why we are also flagging that this is the trap that we should not walk into.
With the world's attention on the war in the Middle East, Zelensky made a surprise visit to Saudi Arabia Thursday, hoping to leverage Ukraine's expertise in defending itself against drone attacks, swapping drone interceptors for air defense missiles it needs to fend off Russian missile attacks.
Joining us now for more analysis is retired Vice Admiral of the U.S. Navy, Robert B. Murrett. Thanks to you so much for joining us, Robert. In terms of the spring offensive, we are about to see more aggression. What would convince you that this offensive is strategically successful, both on the side of Russia and on the side of Ukraine?
Certainly a great question. I think, as we enter the fighting season, as we call it, from the standpoint of the Ukrainians, I think it would be successful if they're able to continue to enforce the pretty tough stance they have had in the eastern and southern parts of their own country. Along those lines, I would mention that Russia has only gained about 1.5% of Ukrainian territory in the last 3 years. In fact, they've suffered some fairly significant losses, as you know, just in the last 2 to 3 weeks. That could shift. I mean, from the Russian standpoint, I think, they certainly are key on that additional territory in the Donbas, as you were just mentioning, specifically in Donetsk, which is part of the negotiations that the United States is trying to broker right now. But unless there are very, very strong security guarantees, I just don't see any way that the leadership in Kyiv is going to be willing to accept that.
Well, those security guarantees is something that Volodymyr Zelensky touched on in an interview with Reuters yesterday, an exclusive. He basically said that security guarantees from the United States were contingent on giving up the Donbas territory, which Ukraine has still 6,000 square kilometers under their control. If we can just remind ourselves and remind our viewers exactly what Zelensky said on that regard.
Yeah, certainly. What he said, and it was interesting, he also mentioned, and this is important, that the actual territory which Russia is asking to get as part of negotiated settlement is a major security guarantee for the Ukrainians. From a tactical battlefield standpoint, again, I defer to my Army colleagues on that. It's my understanding that part of the Donetsk province is strategically important and also is kind of a major pathway, not just into the rest of Ukraine, but really throughout Western Europe because of the territory that it comprises. So, I mean, the territory itself is a security guarantee. And the other thing is any situation where the Ukrainians would be willing to give this up, I think have to be predicated upon assurances that Russia won't ask for more. And I don't see any evidence of that at all. You know, when you listen to what President Putin is saying and his tight-knit group in the Kremlin there, they have not backed off their maximalist gains, you know, the underlying causes, assurances that they want from Ukraine to, completely reduce the size of their military, reject any future NATO membership, and even potentially membership in the European Union. So I don't see, my own sense is looking at this, that even if they were to give up that territory and provide it to the Kremlin, that would not be the end of the discussions. The Kremlin would actually continue to ask for a lot more.
We'll touch on that exact point just after we hear from Zelensky yesterday.
Американці готові на те, щоб
Americans are ready to finalize these guarantees at a high level once Ukraine is ready to withdraw from Donbas.
вийти з Донбасу. На мій погляд, атмосфера
In my view, the Russian side is shaping the atmosphere in its dialogue with the Americans around this very idea, that Ukraine should withdraw from the Donbas. The United States will then provide the security guarantees Ukraine is seeking, and Russians will certainly end this war.
русські точно закінчать.
More or less, this is the triangle we find ourselves in.
В такому трикутнику.
Robert, Zelensky was referring there to that fortified belt in Donetsk and in the Donbas region at large. If you can just tell us about that belt and why it is so crucial and what that actually would mean for Europe if those Ukrainian defenses were no longer there.
It would certainly make it far easier for Russia to conduct offensive operations against Ukraine and potentially beyond Ukraine into Europe, Eastern Europe, and beyond. It is very much a pathway. You know, we always used to study the Fulda Gap during the Cold War in terms of the point of entry from the then Soviet forces into Western Europe. There are some parallels between the Fulda Gap, which we studied so carefully during the Cold War, and that region, those parts of what I'll describe as northwestern Donetsk province, which provide a veritable highway for any army that wanted to conduct operations further into Ukraine and beyond.
And then you mentioned those very small gains that Russia has only been able to make. It took them forever to make inroads into Pokrovsk, for instance. What is actually there for Ukraine to say, okay, well, we should actually listen to this? I mean, it doesn't seem like they would be inclined in any iota to cede any territorial possession.
I think it's directly related, as you were mentioning earlier, to the level of confidence they would have in whatever security guarantees can be provided. And to be frank, I think there's a justifiable skepticism in Kyiv right now in terms of any security guarantees that might be provided by the current leadership in the United States. I say that reluctantly. On the other hand, if there were to be more extensive, real, and, in strategic planning, we tend to draw the distinction between peacekeeping operations and peace enforcement operations. But just, for example, if we were to have peace enforcement operations along the forward line that exists right now between Russian-occupied territory and Ukrainian territory, comprised of, like many Western European nations and others from, I'm just making this up, Japan, India, and so forth, a large international footprint of ground forces that Russia would have to contend with if they renewed offensive operations in the future. I think that would give the Ukrainians a lot more confidence.
How many casualties, though, are we looking at from the Russian side if they actually decide, you know what, we're going to try and take Donbas?
It'd be catastrophic. I mean, I've seen different estimates. They're well into the tens of thousands. But the real backdrop is just the horrific level of killed in action that Russia has continued to take already, just in the operations they've conducted, especially in the last 3 years, and the disregard that the Kremlin leadership seems to have for the high levels of killed and wounded in action that are being inflicted upon the Russian army.
And what do you think it's going to take for the Donald Trump administration to actually start putting the pressure on Moscow? Because Zelensky, in that same interview, he said that it always seems to be Ukraine who receives the pressure from Washington to make amendments, to cede where they otherwise would have held strong. So what is it going to actually take to twist Donald Trump's arm and get the pressure back on Putin?
I think a very much increased level of pressure of all sorts to include increased sanctions. increased arms provision to Ukraine, and assistant, continued diplomatic pressure on Moscow and isolation. They're working very closely with our partners in Western Europe and North America, the Canadians certainly. And I'd like to say that I see the administration doing that in the near future, but it doesn't seem to be in the cards. And the projection, the bottom line that kind of delivers for you is a continued stalemate, and one that could continue for some time.
And do you think that the current war in the Middle East has basically exacerbated that and actually provided Russia the necessary breathing space on the battlefield?
Provided them a certain amount of breathing space, but and certainly a distraction in terms of the international press. However, the two main factors for the war so far, as we go beyond 4 years, is that people continue to underestimate two things, I would say. The first thing they underestimate is the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces and just how good they are at defending their territory. The second thing that people continue to underestimate is how hard-nosed and dug in the position of the Kremlin, that insular group of people in the Kremlin right now, including Putin and his deputies, have in their maximalist domains. They don't want just that territory in the Donbas. They want assurances that a peacekeeping force will not be that strong. They want assurances that there will be a decline in the capability of the Ukrainian military, rejection of future NATO membership, and even potentially, as I was saying, even European Union membership for NATO. And they want a new administration. They don't want to have to deal with the existing leadership that exists in Kyiv, which has been so capable.
And this also comes as NATO says that all US weapons for Ukraine funded by Kyiv's allies through a special NATO program have been delivered or continue to be delivered to the country. Robert B. Murrett, thank you so much for just providing all of that fascinating insight and analysis there on the current situation on the ground after those comments by Vladimir Zelensky as well. Let's just